3 days after Jack Sullivan made camp in the grove of cottonwood trees near Sarah's Creek, the first signs of his true purpose began to emerge. Sarah had grown accustomed to seeing him in the early morning hours, tending to thunder or studying maps that he spread across a flat boulder like a general planning a campaign. He was a quiet presence, moving through his routines with the precision of a man who had learned to live by careful habits. What she hadn't expected was to find him gone when she woke on Thursday morning, his campsite empty except for a note tied to a tree branch near the house. The message was brief and written in the careful script of someone who had received formal education. Gone to town for supplies. Back before dark. Stay alert. Sarah spent the day feeling more nervous than she had since Blackwood's visit. She had grown to depend on Sullivan's presence more than she cared to admit, and his absence made her realize how vulnerable she and Emma still were. Every sound made her jump. Every shadow seemed to hide potential threats. When Emma asked why she kept looking out the windows, Sarah found herself struggling for an explanation that wouldn't frighten her daughter. Sullivan returned just as the sun was setting, but he wasn't alone. A second rider accompanied him, an older man with silver hair and the kind of weathered face that came from decades of outdoor work. As they approached the house, Sarah could see that the newcomer wore a badge on his vest and carried himself with the authority of long-held office. "Mrs. Mitchell," Sullivan called out as they dismounted near the porch. "I'd like you to meet Sheriff Tom Hendricks from Cedar Falls. He's been helping me with some research into your husband's death." Hendricks removed his hat and nodded respectfully. "Ma'am, I'm sorry for your loss, and I apologize for the circumstances that bring me here." Sarah invited both men inside, where Emma was setting the table for their simple dinner. The sheriff's presence seemed to make the little girl nervous, and she stayed close to her mother as the adults settled into chairs around the kitchen table. "Sheriff Hendricks has some information that I think you need to hear," Sullivan began. "Tom, why don't you tell her what you found in Morrison's belongings?" Hendricks reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather journal, its pages yellowed with age and use. This was hidden in Morrison's cabin after his body was discovered. It contains detailed records of payments made to various officials in Millbrook, including amounts, dates, and what he calls services rendered. "What kind of services?" Sarah asked, though she suspected she already knew the answer. "Mostly related to mining claims," Hendricks replied, opening the journal to a page marked with a strip of cloth. Morrison was paying people to falsify survey reports, forge transfer documents, and intimidate miners into selling their claims for below-market prices. The operation was being run through the Consolidated Mining Company, with Blackwood acting as the front man. Sullivan leaned forward in his chair. But the really interesting part comes later in the journal, when Morrison started getting worried about his own safety. Hendricks turned to another marked page and began reading in his slow, careful voice. "They want me to sign papers saying Thomas Mitchell owes money for my claims. I told them Mitchell never had anything to do with my business, but Blackwood says they need someone to blame when the claims turn out to be worthless. Says Mitchell's already suspicious about the beam that collapsed in Shaft 7. Sarah felt her breath catch in her throat. "The beam that killed Thomas?" "According to Morrison's notes," Sullivan continued, "your husband had been asking questions about safety conditions in the mine. He thought some of the accidents weren't really accidents, and he was starting to gather evidence to present to the territorial mining inspector. So they killed him to keep him quiet," Sarah said, the words feeling strange in her mouth even as she spoke them. "And then they tried to use his name to legitimize their theft of Morrison's claims," Hendricks added. "When Morrison threatened to expose the whole operation, they killed him too and forged documents making it look like he had the Cowboy dismounted with the fluid grace of someone who had spent more years in the saddle than on solid ground." His weathered face showed no emotion as he surveyed the scene, taking in every detail with the practiced eye of a man who had learned to read danger in the set of a man's shoulders and the position of his hands. Though he carried no visible weapons, there was something about his presence that made Blackwood's men unconsciously step back. "I said this doesn't concern you," Blackwood repeated, his voice carrying more authority this time. "These are legal proceedings authorized by the territorial court." The stranger's gaze moved slowly from Blackwood to the sobbing child clinging to her mother's skirts. Then, to the armed men who surrounded them. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured, carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "Let me see those papers." "You have no legal standing to examine official documents," Blackwood protested, though he made no move to prevent the stranger from approaching. Something about the man's quiet confidence suggested that resistance might prove more trouble than it was worth. Without waiting for permission, the cowboy took the documents from Sarah's trembling hands. His eyes moved across the pages with surprising speed and comprehension, suggesting a level of education that didn't match his rough appearance. After several minutes of careful reading, he looked up with an expression that might have been amusement. "Interesting," he said quietly. "Very interesting indeed." "What's interesting about it?" Sarah asked desperately. "Are you a lawyer? Can you help us?" The stranger didn't answer directly. Instead, he turned his attention back to Blackwood with a look that made the thin man take an involuntary step backward. "This document is signed by Judge Harrison," the cowboy observed. "Problem is, Judge Harrison died of a heart attack 3 weeks ago. I was at his funeral." Blackwood's face went pale, but he quickly recovered his composure. "That's impossible. These papers were processed just last week." "Were they?" The stranger's voice remained calm, but there was an edge to it now that made even the armed men shift uncomfortably. "Because I'm looking at a signature that's supposed to be from a dead man, and an official seal that doesn't match the ones used by the territorial court." Sarah felt her heart leap with sudden hope. "You mean these papers are fake?" "More than fake," the cowboy replied. "They're evidence of fraud, forgery, and conspiracy. In some territories, crimes like these carry a penalty of 20 years in prison." Blackwood's carefully maintained composure finally cracked. "You don't know what you're talking about. These documents are perfectly legitimate." "Then, you won't mind if I take them to the sheriff for verification," the stranger suggested, folding the papers and tucking them into his vest. "I'm sure he'd be very interested in seeing Judge Harrison's signature from beyond the grave." One of the armed men stepped forward, his hand moving to his gun. "Give those papers back, mister. We've got business to finish here." The cowboy's response was so fast that Sarah barely saw it happen. One moment the gunman was reaching for his weapon, and the next he was on the ground, clutching his wrist and groaning in pain. The stranger had moved with the speed and precision of a striking snake, disarming the man without drawing a weapon of his own. "Anyone else want to discuss this further?" the cowboy asked calmly, as if nothing had happened. The remaining gunman looked to Blackwood for guidance, but the thin man was staring at the stranger with a mixture of fear and recognition. "I know you," Blackwood said slowly. "You're Jack Sullivan, the one they call the Ghost." Sarah had heard the name whispered in saloons and general stores throughout the territory. Jack Sullivan was a legend, a man who had supposedly been everything from a Texas Ranger to a bounty hunter to a gun for hire. Some said he was the fastest draw who ever lived. Others claimed he could track a man across solid rock and through running water. Most agreed that when Jack Sullivan took an interest in your business, your life was about to become very complicated. "Reputation can be a useful thing," Sullivan acknowledged. "Saves time on unnecessary conversations." "Look, Sullivan," Blackwood began, his earlier arrogance replaced by nervous calculation. "There's no need for this to get ugly. We can work something out. I'm listening. The mining company doesn't really care about the kid. It's about the principle of debt collection. If someone could guarantee payment of the amount owed, alternative arrangements could be made." Sarah's heart sank again. Even if the papers were fraudulent, the debt itself might still be real. $4,000 was still an impossible sum, no matter who guaranteed it. "How much time would be required for payment?" Sullivan asked. "Full payment would need to be made within 30 days, Blackwood replied, clearly believing he was negotiating from a position of strength. "The company has been patient enough." Sullivan nodded thoughtfully, then reached into his saddlebags and withdrew a leather pouch that clinked with the unmistakable sound of coins. Sarah watched in amazement as he counted out gold pieces, the morning sunlight glinting off the metal as it accumulated in his palm. $4,200, he said, handing the money to Blackwood. "I trust that settles the matter." Blackwood stared at the gold in his hands as if he couldn't quite believe what had just happened. "You're paying her debt? Why would you do that?" "Private business," Sullivan replied curtly. "The important thing is that the debt is now satisfied. You have your money, and the child stays with her mother. This doesn't make any sense, Blackwood protested. You don't even know these people. I know enough, Sullivan said, his voice carrying a tone of finality that suggested the conversation was over. As Blackwood and his men prepared to leave, the thin man turned back with one final attempt to salvage something from the situation. You realize this woman now owes you $4,000 instead of owing the company. What makes you think she'll be any more able to pay you than she was to pay us? Sullivan's response was simple and devastating. That's between her and me. After the men had ridden away, their departure marked by a cloud of dust, and the clear sense that they were grateful to escape the situation intact, Sarah found herself alone with the man who had just saved her daughter. Emma was still clinging to her mother's skirts, but the tears had stopped, replaced by the wide-eyed curiosity children show when the adult world reveals its complexities. I don't understand, Sarah said finally. Why would you give that much money to help strangers? Sullivan was securing his saddlebags, preparing to mount his horse as if nothing extraordinary had just occurred. Sometimes helping strangers is easier than helping yourself. But for $1,000, that's a fortune. How will I ever be able to pay you back? For the first time since his arrival, Sullivan's expression softened slightly. Who says you have to pay me back? Everyone has to pay their debts, Sarah replied, the lessons of a lifetime making her incapable of accepting such generosity without question. That's how the world works. Maybe it's time the world worked a little differently. Sullivan mounted his horse with the same fluid grace he had shown in dismounting, but instead of riding away as Sarah expected, he remained where he was, looking down at her with an unreadable expression. Those men will be back, he said quietly. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but they'll be back. Fraudulent papers or not. Men like Blackwood don't give up easily when there's money involved. Sarah felt the brief moment of relief drain away, replaced by a new kind of fear. What do you mean? I mean they'll find another way to get what they want. Maybe they'll discover some other debt your husband left behind. Maybe they'll claim you owe money for something else entirely. Maybe they'll just decide to take your daughter anyway and worry about the legal justification later. But you paid them. The debt is settled. I paid them for today, Sullivan corrected. But men like that always find new reasons to come calling. The only way to be truly safe from them is to make sure they understand that bothering you would be more trouble than it's worth. Emma tugged at her mother's sleeve. Mama, is the scary man coming back? Sarah looked down at her daughter's upturned face and felt the weight of responsibility settle on her shoulders like a lead blanket. She had no money, no family to turn to for help, and no skills beyond washing clothes and mending tears. How could she possibly protect her child from men who had the law on their side and guns on their hips? I don't know what to do, she admitted to Sullivan. I don't know how to fight people like that. You don't have to fight them, he replied. But you do need to be prepared for when they come back. How can I be prepared? I'm just one woman with no money and no help. Sullivan dismounted again and walked over to where Emma was standing. He knelt down so that he was at her eye level, his weathered features gentle despite the hardness that seemed to define him. What's your name, little lady? Emma. The girl replied in a whisper, still intimidated by this stranger who had somehow become their savior. Emma's a pretty name, Sullivan said with a slight smile. Do you like horses, Emma? The girl nodded, her fear beginning to be replaced by curiosity. My horse's name is Thunder, Sullivan continued, gesturing toward his mount. Would you like to meet him? Under normal circumstances, Sarah would have been cautious about letting her daughter approach a stranger's horse. But nothing about this day had been normal. She watched as Sullivan led Emma toward the animal, speaking to her in low, reassuring tones. Thunder was a magnificent black stallion with intelligence in his eyes and the kind of calm temperament that suggested extensive training. As Emma tentatively reached out to touch the horse's nose, Sullivan kept one hand on the animal's neck and the other ready to protect the child if necessary. He likes you, Sullivan told Emma as the horse allowed her to pat his forehead. Thunder doesn't usually trust people this quickly. He's beautiful, Emma breathed, her voice filled with wonder. While her daughter was distracted by the horse, Sullivan turned his attention back to Sarah. I have a proposition for you. What kind of proposition? Your property is isolated, which makes it vulnerable. But it also makes it private. I need a place to stay for a while, somewhere I can keep an eye on the surrounding area without drawing attention from town. Sarah felt a flutter of alarm. You want to live here? Not in your house, Sullivan clarified quickly. I could set up camp somewhere on your land, maybe in that grove of trees near the creek. In exchange, I'd provide protection for you and your daughter, plus enough money to cover your basic expenses. The offer was tempting, but Sarah had been raised to be cautious about arrangements that seemed too good to be true. Why would you want to stay here? What aren't you telling me? Sullivan was quiet for a long moment, his gaze focused on something in the distance that only he could see. When he finally spoke, his voice carried a weight of old pain that made Sarah understand that she wasn't the only one carrying burdens. Let's just say that Blackwood and his associates aren't the only people in this territory who deserve to have their activities looked into more closely. You're here on some kind of business. I'm here because there are things that need to be set right, Sullivan replied carefully. Your situation with Blackwood just happened to intersect with my other concerns. Sarah studied his face, trying to read the truth behind his carefully chosen words. Everything about this man suggested competence and reliability, but she had learned through bitter experience that appearances could be deceiving. Thomas had seemed reliable too, right up until the moment she discovered the debts he had hidden from her. If I agree to this arrangement, she said slowly, what exactly would it involve? You'd continue your normal routine, taking in laundry, caring for your daughter, maintaining your household. I'd be nearby, but not underfoot. If anyone comes around asking questions or making demands, I'd handle the situation. For how long? Until my business here is finished. Could be weeks, could be months. Emma had moved on from petting Thunder to examining his saddle and bridle with the fascination children show for well-made things. Sullivan watched her with an expression that suggested he wasn't accustomed to being around young children, but found the experience less unpleasant than he had expected. Can I trust you? Sarah asked directly, deciding that this was a situation that called for blunt honesty rather than polite evasion. Sullivan met her gaze without flinching. If I wanted to hurt you or your daughter, I had plenty of opportunity while Blackwood and his men were here. I chose to help instead. It wasn't exactly an answer to her question, but it was the closest thing to reassurance she was likely to get from a man who clearly kept his own counsel. More importantly, it was probably the best offer she was going to receive from anyone. All right, she said finally, but I want to know what kind of business you're really here to conduct. If I'm putting my daughter at risk by agreeing to this, I have a right to know what I'm getting involved in. Sullivan nodded, as if he had expected this condition. Fair enough. There's a man named Morrison who used to work the mining claims around here. The same Morrison whose debts were supposedly transferred to your husband. The one who ran away? The one who was murdered, Sullivan corrected grimly. His body was found in a canyon about 50 miles north of here, shot in the back and left for the buzzards. The interesting thing is that he was killed 3 weeks after he supposedly abandoned his claims and fled the territory. Sarah felt a chill run down her spine as the implications became clear. You think Blackwood killed him? I think Blackwood is part of an operation that's been systematically cheating miners out of their claims and then disposing of anyone who might cause problems. Your husband's death might not have been an accident either. The words hit Sarah like a physical blow. The mine supervisors had told her that Thomas died when a support beam collapsed, crushing him instantly. They had been very sympathetic, very helpful with the funeral arrangements, and very quick to close the investigation without asking too many questions. You think they murdered my husband? I think it's a possibility worth investigating, Sullivan replied carefully. Men who forge legal documents and threaten children aren't usually above murder when it serves their purposes. Emma had finished her examination of Thunder and was now picking wildflowers near the creek, humming the same tune she had been singing when the day began. Looking at her daughter's innocent contentment, Sarah felt a surge of protective fury that surprised her with its intensity. If what you're saying is true, she said quietly, then I want them to pay for what they've done. They will, Sullivan promised, and something in his voice made Sarah believe that justice, however long delayed, was finally coming to Millbrook. Sarah Mitchell wiped the sweat from her forehead as she hung the last of the laundry on the line behind her small wooden house. The September morning was already growing warm, and She could feel the familiar ache in her shoulders from the long hours she spent taking and washing for the wealthier families in Millbrook. It had been 8 months since her husband Thomas had died in the mining accident, and every day since then had been a struggle to keep food on the table and a roof over their heads. Emma's laughter drifted across the yard as she chased a butterfly near the vegetable garden. At 8 years old, she still possessed that wonderful ability children have to find joy in the simplest things, despite the hardships they faced. Sarah smiled, watching her daughter's carefree movements. Emma had her father's dark hair and curious eyes, but thankfully she had been spared his tendency toward worry and debt. Or so Sarah had believed until today. The sound of approaching horses made Sarah look up from her work. 3 men rode slowly down the dirt path that led to her house, their faces hidden beneath the brims of their hats. Something about their deliberate pace and formal posture made her stomach clench with worry. Visitors were rare, and men who rode with such purpose usually brought trouble. The lead rider was a tall, thin man in a black suit that looked out of place in the rural setting. His companions wore the kind of clothes that suggested they were comfortable with violence, worn leather vests, gun belts that showed signs of regular use, and the hard expressions of men who had seen too much of the world's darker side. As they drew closer, Sarah could see the badge glinting on the thin man's vest. He was some kind of official, which made the knot in her stomach tighten even more. "Mrs. Sarah Mitchell," the man in the suit called out as he dismounted his horse. His voice was clipped and formal, carrying the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed. "Yes, that's me," Sarah replied, instinctively moving closer to where Emma was playing. "What can I do for you, gentlemen?" The man reached into his jacket and withdrew a folded document, its official seals and ribbons immediately recognizable as legal papers. "My name is Jeremiah Blackwood, and I'm here representing the Consolidated Mining Company. I'm afraid I have some rather serious business to discuss with you regarding debts left behind by your late husband." Sarah felt the blood drain from her face. Thomas had mentioned some gambling debts in the weeks before his death, but she had assumed they were small amounts, the kind of money troubles that came from too many nights at the saloon when the mining work was sparse. "I don't understand." Thomas never mentioned anything about the mining company. Blackwood unfolded the document with theatrical precision, clearly enjoying the drama of the moment. "Your husband signed a personal guarantee for a substantial loan taken out by his mining partner, Jake Morrison. When Morrison abandoned his claims and fled town 6 months ago, your husband became liable for the full amount. The debt, including accumulated interest and penalties, now stands at $4,200. The number hit Sarah like a physical blow. $4,000 might as well have been $4 million for someone in her circumstances. She made perhaps $30 a month taking in laundry and mending clothes, barely enough to cover their basic needs. Even if she could save every penny, it would take her more than 10 years to pay such an amount. "That's impossible," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "Thomas would have told me about something so serious." "Men rarely tell their wives about their business failures," Blackwood replied with cruel satisfaction. "Perhaps he thought he could resolve the matter before it became your problem. Unfortunately, death has a way of making all problems permanent." Emma had stopped playing and was now watching the conversation with the intuitive sense children have for detecting danger. She moved closer to her mother, her small hand finding Sarah's and squeezing tight. "Even if what you're saying is true," Sarah said, finding her voice again, "I don't have that kind of money. I can barely afford to feed my daughter." "Oh, we understand your financial limitations completely," Blackwood said, his smile growing wider and more predatory. "That's why the mining company has been so generous in accepting alternative forms of payment." One of the other men stepped forward, his hand resting casually on the grip of his gun. Sarah noticed that several other riders had positioned themselves along the road leading to town, cutting off any possibility of escape or calling for help. "What kind of alternative payment?" Sarah asked, though she was beginning to fear she already knew the answer. "Child labor contracts are perfectly legal in this territory," Blackwood explained, his tone becoming even more formal and businesslike. "Your daughter would work in the company dormitories for a period of 7 years, at which time the debt would be considered satisfied. She would receive food, shelter, and basic education. It's really quite generous when you consider the circumstances. You want to take my daughter? Sarah's voice rose to a near shout, causing Emma to shrink back against her legs. She's 8 years old enough to work in the textile mills. One of the armed men spoke up. Lots of kids her age working there. Some even younger. Sarah's mind raced desperately, searching for any possible escape from this nightmare. There has to be another way. I could work extra hours, take on more clients. I could pay something each month. Blackwood shook his head with mock sympathy. The mining company has already been more than patient. This debt has been outstanding for over 6 months. Legal proceedings have already begun, and the sheriff has signed the necessary papers for collection. He gestured toward his armed companions. These gentlemen are here to ensure the process goes smoothly. Please, Sarah begged, tears beginning to stream down her face. She's all I have left. Take the house, take everything I own, but please don't take my daughter. The house and your possessions wouldn't cover even a fraction of what's owed. Blackwood replied coldly. Now, please gather the child's things. We'll be leaving within the hour. Emma began to cry, clinging desperately to her mother's skirts. Sarah wrapped her arms around her daughter, her mind refusing to accept what was happening. This couldn't be real. This couldn't be legal. There had to be someone who could help them, some authority higher than these men who could intervene. I want to see these papers, Sarah demanded, trying to inject some strength back into her voice. I want to read every word before I let you take her anywhere. Blackwood handed over the documents with obvious reluctance. Sarah had never been much of a reader. Formal education hadn't been available to girls in her generation. But she could make out enough of the legal language to understand that the papers appeared genuine. There were official seals, signatures from judges she recognized by name, and enough complicated terminology to suggest they had been prepared by someone with legal training. This can't be right, she muttered, scanning the pages for anything that might offer hope. There has to be some mistake. No mistake, Blackwood assured her. Everything is perfectly legal and properly documented. The territorial courts have been quite clear about debt collection procedures, especially in cases involving mining operations. Too much money has been lost to people who think they can simply walk away from their obligations. As Sarah continued reading, she became aware of a new presence nearby. A lone rider had appeared on the ridge overlooking her property, his horse standing perfectly still as he watched the proceedings below. Even from a distance, there was something about the way he sat in the saddle that suggested confidence and competence. He made no move to approach or interfere, but his presence was somehow comforting in a situation that had spiraled completely beyond her control. "Who is that?" asked one of Blackwood's men, following her gaze to the ridge. "Nobody important," Blackwood replied without even looking. "Just another drifter passing through town. We see them all the time." But, as Sarah watched, she noticed something odd about the distant figure. While most travelers would have continued on their way after satisfying their curiosity, this man remained motionless, his attention focused entirely on what was happening in her yard. There was an intensity to his posture that suggested he was more than a casual observer. "Mama, I don't want to go with these men," Emma whispered, her voice breaking Sarah's heart into even smaller pieces. "I know, sweetheart," Sarah replied, pulling her daughter closer. "Mama's going to figure something out. I promise." But even as she spoke the words, Sarah couldn't see any way out of their situation. The men were armed and clearly prepared to use force if necessary. The legal documents appeared to be legitimate, which meant even the sheriff would be on their side if it came to a confrontation. She was a widow with no family, no money, and no influence. In a world where women had few rights and children had even fewer, there seemed to be no power capable of standing against the mining company's legal claim. "Time's up," Blackwood announced, checking his pocket watch with theatrical precision. "We need to be back in town before noon." "Wait," Sarah said desperately. "Let me at least pack some of her clothes, some of her toys. You can't just take her with nothing." "5 minutes," Blackwood agreed. "But don't try anything foolish. My associates here are very good at their job, and they don't like complications." Sarah rushed into the house with Emma close behind, her hands shaking as she threw together a small bundle of her daughter's possessions. Emma's favorite dress, the doll that had belonged to Sarah's own mother, a few books that Thomas had managed to buy before his death, Such pitiful treasures to represent an entire childhood that was about to be stolen away. "Mama, what's going to happen to me?" Emma asked, her young mind struggling to understand the magnitude of what was occurring. "I don't know, baby," Sarah admitted, kneeling down to look her daughter in the eyes. "But I want you to remember that I love you more than anything in this world. And I'm going to find a way to get you back. No matter how long it takes, no matter what I have to do, I will find you and bring you home." Emma nodded solemnly, her trust in her mother's promise evident despite the terror in her eyes. Sarah kissed her daughter's forehead and tried to memorize every detail of her face, knowing it might be months or even years before she saw her again. As they emerged from the house, Sarah noticed that the lone rider on the ridge had moved closer, though he still maintained his distance from the immediate confrontation. Something about his positioning suggested he was studying the situation carefully, perhaps looking for weaknesses in the group of men who had come to collect Emma. "That's enough," Blackwood declared as Sarah handed Emma the small bundle of belongings. "Time to go." One of the armed men stepped forward to take Emma's arm, but the little girl shrank back against her mother with a cry of fear. The man's grip tightened, and Sarah saw a flash of impatience cross his weathered features. "Please," Sarah begged one final time. "There has to be another way." "There is no other way," Blackwood replied firmly. "The debt must be paid, and this is the only currency you have available." As the man began to forcibly separate Emma from her mother, Sarah's desperation reached a breaking point. She threw herself between them, her protective instincts overriding any concern for her own safety. "You'll have to go through me first," she declared, her voice carrying a strength that surprised even herself. The confrontation was escalating toward violence when a new voice cut through the tension like a knife through silk. "That's far enough." Everyone turned to see the lone rider walking his horse slowly down the slope toward them, his approach deliberate and unhurried. Now that he was closer, Sarah could see that he was a tall man wearing the kind of clothes that suggested he lived most of his life outdoors, worn leather chaps, a dust-covered hat, and the confident bearing of someone who was comfortable with danger. Most notably, he wore no gun belt, which made his willingness to intervene in an armed confrontation all the more remarkable. In a land where disputes were often settled with violence, approaching three armed men while unarmed required either tremendous courage or complete foolishness. "This is none of your concern, stranger," Blackwood called out, his hand moving instinctively toward the gun beneath his jacket. "I suggest you keep moving." The cowboy continued his approach without responding, his eyes fixed on the scene before him with an intensity that made even Blackwood's armed companions shift nervously in their saddles. Sarah found herself holding her breath, wondering if this mysterious stranger represented salvation or simply another complication in an already impossible situation. Either way, his arrival had changed the dynamic of the confrontation, and, for the first time since the men had arrived, she felt a tiny spark of hope flickering in the darkness that had engulfed her world, in the dusty town of Millbrook, where hope seemed as scarce as rain in summer. A mother's worst nightmare was about to unfold in broad daylight. Sarah Mitchell had always believed that love could conquer anything, that hard work would eventually pay off, and that no one could ever take away what mattered most to her. She was wrong on all counts. The morning sun cast long shadows across the wooden porch where 8-year-old Emma played with her worn-out doll, humming a tune her mother had taught her. Neither of them knew that in less than an hour, armed men would arrive with legal papers that would tear their world apart. Neither of them knew that a debt her late husband had hidden would come calling like a vulture circling its prey. And neither of them knew that a mysterious cowboy, who had been watching from the ridge above town for 3 days without speaking a single word to anyone, was about to change the course of their lives forever. Some stories begin with hope. Others start with despair. This one begins with a mother's scream that would echo through the canyon walls and awaken something fierce in the heart of a stranger who had sworn never to get involved in other people's troubles again. What happens when the law itself becomes the enemy? When those sworn to protect become the very people you need protection from? When a single mother discovers that her child can be taken as payment for a dead man's debt? The answer lies in the dust, the silence, and the unexpected courage of a man who had forgotten how to trust the world until he heard a child's cry for help.